It started as a favor to my cousin Jack, who owned a small 24-hour gas station tucked along a desolate stretch of highway. Someone called off sick, and I agreed to take the late-night shift, figuring it would be an easy few bucks. I arrived just before 11 p.m., the parking lot eerily silent except for the flickering neon open sign buzzing overhead. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I spent most of the time scrolling through my phone behind the counter, glancing up occasionally at the security monitors. The clock dragged, the store's humming fluorescent lights weighing down on me like a heavy blanket. It was after 2 a.m. when the first customer arrived. He was tall, gaunt and strangely dressed, an old, oversized jacket and scuffed boots despite the mild autumn weather. He wandered the aisles without speaking, only his slow footsteps echoing in the store. I tried to shake off the unease as I watched him through the convex security mirror. Finally, he placed a single bottle of water on the counter. His fingers, pale and cracked, drummed on the counter rhythmically, each tap making me more on edge. He didn't say a word. I rang up the water, told him the total, and he handed me a wrinkled bill without breaking eye contact. His gaze, hollow and unblinking, bore into me. "Long night?" I asked awkwardly, trying to fill the silence. He didn't answer. He only smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile you'd give to something you already own. As he left, he paused at the door for just a moment, glancing back at me before vanishing into the night. Something about the way he looked back made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off and went back to scrolling through my phone. 10 minutes later, I heard it, a soft knocking on the glass door. It was the same man. He stood just outside, his face inches from the glass, smiling that same unsettling smile. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I waved him off, but he didn't budge. The way he stood, so still, as if he could stand there forever, unnerved me more than if he had tried to break in. I considered calling Jack, but before I could reach for the phone, the man abruptly turned and walked off, disappearing into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Just as I started to relax, I noticed the security monitor flicker. In the grainy black and white footage, the man was back, but he wasn't at the front entrance. He was inside the store, standing motionless in the back aisle. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard the door chime. Heart pounding, I shot a glance toward the aisles, but no one was there. I checked the monitor again. He was gone. Sweat trickled down my spine as my brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe the camera was glitching, I thought. I stared at the screens, expecting him to appear again. Then I heard it, a faint tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the storage room in the back. I swallowed hard, grabbing the flashlight from under the counter. Each step toward the storage room felt heavier than the last. My legs sluggish like I was wading through thick mud. The door to the back room was ajar, swinging slightly as if someone had just slipped inside. I took a deep breath and nudged it open with the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I froze. There in the corner stood the man, facing the wall, his head slightly tilted. His shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths, but he made no sound. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. "You need to leave," I whispered, but my voice came out weak, more a plea than a command. Slowly, the man turned his head toward me, his eyes empty, as if there was nothing behind them. That's when I noticed something: his jacket. It wasn't just old. It was identical to the one Jack wore. The same patched sleeve, the same torn pocket. My mind whirled. How did he get it? Why did it fit him so perfectly? Before I could react, the man took a slow, deliberate step toward me. His smile widened, stretching too far, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. The flashlight slipped from my trembling hands, clattering to the ground. And then the lights in the store flickered and went out. I drive for a rideshare service to make ends meet, mostly working the late shifts. Nights are quieter, tips are better, and I enjoy the solitude of the empty highways. But there's one night I wish I hadn't been working. It was a Wednesday, around 2:30 a.m., and I was thinking about calling it a night when a ride request popped up. The pickup location was a gas station just outside town, a bit far but not unusual. I accepted, figuring it would be my last trip before heading home. The gas station looked deserted when I arrived, illuminated only by the dim, flickering lights under the canopy. I waited a couple of minutes, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, when suddenly the passenger door opened. A man got in, middle-aged, greasy hair slicked back, wearing a faded brown jacket that smelled faintly of oil. He gave me a crooked smile, and I noticed his eyes, too wide, as if they didn't blink enough. "Thanks for picking me up," he said, his voice low and raspy, like he hadn't spoken all night. He didn't say where he was headed, just muttered, "Start driving, I'll give you directions along the way." Every instinct screamed at me to cancel the ride, but I didn't. My hand hovered over my phone for a second, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. I pulled out of the gas station and drove down the empty highway, the man giving occasional instructions from the back seat. He didn't say much, only directions. Left here, keep going straight, next right. The further we drove, the darker it got. The town lights vanished behind us, swallowed by the surrounding fields and dense forest. No streetlights, no other cars, just us on a lonely stretch of road. About 15 minutes in, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the front seat. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, and my skin prickled. "You're doing great," he whispered, almost like a parent comforting a child. "Almost there." "Almost where?" I glanced at the map, but it wasn't much help. The pin he dropped was in the middle of nowhere. Just a blank spot on the map. No landmarks, no buildings, nothing. My heart started to race. I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, "So, what's out here anyway?" The man chuckled softly, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was slow, deliberate, like he was enjoying some private joke I wasn't in on. "Oh, you'll see soon enough." I gripped the wheel tighter. The road was narrowing, the forest pressing in closer, the branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. I thought about turning around, dropping him off right there, but we were already so far from town, and I didn't want any trouble. Then he gave me one final instruction: "Pull over right here." I slowed the car, heart pounding. The spot he chose wasn't a driveway or even a trail, just a patch of dirt on the side of the road, surrounded by nothing but black forest. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the tree line. Then, without turning his head, he muttered, "Turn off the engine." My hands shook as I cut the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. Just the creak of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. He didn't get out. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, still as a statue, that strange smile plastered on his face. I forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. "So, this is it, huh? I guess we're here." His smile widened. "Almost," he whispered. I reached for my phone, pretending to check the route, but my heart stopped when I realized the app had disconnected. No signal, no map, no way to call anyone. The air inside the car grew thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite name, like dread, like the kind of fear you can't run from. My mouth went dry, and I could feel sweat collecting on my back. "Well," I said, my voice cracking, "if we're done here, maybe I'll just..." Then I heard a rustling from the woods. Faint, but deliberate. Something, or someone was out there. I turned toward the noise, squinting into the darkness beyond the car window. The man beside me didn't move. He just stared, unblinking, at the trees. "Do you see them?" he whispered. His voice was barely audible, as if he were speaking to himself. "They've been waiting for me." My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't know who or what he was talking about, and I didn't want to find out. I reached for the keys, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a vice-like grip. His nails dug into my skin, and I gasped as the pain shot through my arm. "Don't," he said softly, almost pleading. "Not yet." The rustling outside grew louder, closer. Branches snapped. Something was coming toward us, and the man's grip only tightened. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Whatever you do," he whispered, "don't look in the mirror." Instinctively, my gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, just for a second, and what I saw froze the breath in my lungs. There, in the reflection, something moved in the back seat, something that shouldn't have been there. I didn't wait to find out more. I yanked my arm free, jammed the key into the ignition, and slammed the car into drive. Tires screeched, dirt kicked up, and the man started laughing, a high, maniacal sound that echoed in my ears long after I sped off into the night. It started as a peaceful afternoon hike, a way to clear my mind after a stressful week. I'd done the trail a dozen times before, but this time, I decided to take a lesser-known path I'd always avoided out of habit. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves gradually giving way to a thick silence. There was no wind, no distant hum of insects, just the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt path. That's when I noticed it, another set of footsteps, faint but steady, falling in rhythm with mine. At first, I told myself it was nothing, probably another hiker. I kept moving, glancing behind me every few minutes. But each time I stopped to listen, the other footsteps stopped too, as if someone were deliberately keeping pace. My pulse quickened. The trees seemed closer now, their shadows stretching longer across the trail. I clenched my fists and tried to shake off the growing unease. If someone was out there, why wouldn't they just pass me? After another few minutes, I picked up my pace, moving briskly through the twisting path. The sunlight, which had been filtering gently through the canopy, now seemed thin and weak. I kept telling myself that it was just the forest playing tricks on me, but the footsteps never stopped. They stayed behind me, matching every step I took, sometimes speeding up when I did. Then I heard a sharp crack, a branch snapping underfoot, way too close to ignore. I froze. Whoever was behind me stopped too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around quickly, scanning the trail. There was no one, just trees, tall, silent, unmoving. But I knew someone was there. I could feel it, the way you can feel when someone's eyes are boring into your back. My breathing hitched as I strained to hear something, anything, but all I caught was the distant rustle of leaves. I had to keep moving. Turning back didn't feel safe anymore. Whoever was behind me clearly didn't want to be seen, and that was worse than any animal I might encounter. I picked up my pace, practically jogging along the uneven path. The air felt heavier, like the forest was closing in around me, every tree trunk beginning to look the same. My mind raced. Was it some kind of prank? A stalker? A dangerous camper? Then I saw it, something that sent a cold rush through my veins. Up ahead, on a branch just off the trail, hung a torn piece of red fabric, fluttering weakly in the breeze. I recognized it immediately. A woman wearing a red jacket had passed me at the trailhead earlier that day. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered against my rib cage as I glanced down at the ground. The soil near the branch looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had dragged something heavy off the trail and into the dense underbrush. I knew I needed to get out fast, but the path ahead was unfamiliar, twisting in every direction. The map in my pocket felt useless now. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, desperate to check the GPS. No signal. Of course. Then, just as I turned to move, I heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps closer now. They weren't trying to stay hidden anymore. I knew whoever it was, they were coming for me. Panic set in. My legs felt numb, but I forced myself to run, the trail blurring as my eyes darted in every direction. My lungs burned, and every breath felt like a struggle, but I kept going, knowing I couldn't stop. Stopping wasn't an option. And then I saw it, a figure just ahead on the trail. They stood still, blocking the narrow path, their face hidden beneath a dark hood. I skidded to a halt, my mind screaming at me to turn around, but something about the way they stood, so calm, so deliberate, made it clear there was no escape. I wasn't running from them. I had been running toward them. The hooded figure took a slow step toward me, and that's when I saw it, the edge of a hunting knife glinting in their hand. My throat went dry, my legs frozen. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Without thinking, I turned and bolted into the forest, off the trail, branches whipping my face and tearing at my clothes. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my legs gave out beneath me. I collapsed behind a fallen tree, pressing myself into the damp ground, gasping for air. Every sound around me became a threat. Every twig snap, every gust of wind. I could still hear footsteps, somewhere out there, getting closer. I fumbled with my phone again, desperately hitting the emergency call button. No signal. The footsteps stopped, and I knew they were close. Too close. I bit down on my lip to keep from sobbing. And then I saw them, a pair of boots, just inches from where I hid. They stood there for a moment, silent, waiting, listening. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't see me. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain they could hear it. The boots lingered, and then, without a word, they turned and walked away, the sound of footsteps growing fainter until the forest swallowed them whole. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When I finally found the courage to stand, I ran the entire way back to the trailhead, not daring to look back. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I never reported it. I told myself I'd imagined it all, that it was just someone else hiking late. But every time I think back to that day, I remember the boots, how they stopped exactly where I had hidden like they knew I was there. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't kept running? A friend of mine asked if I could swing by and feed her cat while she was out of town. I had the spare key, knew the address, and figured it would be in and out in 5 minutes. What could go wrong? The street was quiet when I pulled up. Rows of identical suburban houses lined both sides, each one blending into the next. I parked outside what I thought was her house, a beige 2-story with a red mailbox, and jogged up the porch steps. The air smelled of wet leaves, and a dull autumn wind rattled the branches overhead. The key slid easily into the lock, and the door swung open with a low creak. The house was eerily silent. No hum from a fridge, no distant ticking of a clock, just the weight of stillness pressing down around me. Something felt off right away, but I brushed it off. I was in and out, I told myself. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The lights were off, and the curtains drawn tightly shut, blocking out what little daylight was left. I fumbled for the light switch near the door, but nothing happened. Cheap bulbs? I muttered under my breath, pulling out my phone for a flashlight. As the beam cut through the gloom, I noticed something odd, furniture that didn't look quite right. The couch was too old, the walls decorated with unfamiliar paintings. This wasn't her style at all. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. I pulled out my phone, checking her text message again. The address matched. It didn't make sense. Maybe she redecorated, I thought. Or maybe I remembered wrong. All these houses looked the same anyway. I took a few cautious steps further inside, calling out softly, "Milo? Here, kitty." No response. Just the unsettling quiet pressing down on me. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen, my shoes making the faintest squeak on the wood floors. The air smelled stale, like the house had been locked up for too long. The kitchen was cluttered, plates left on the counter, a half-empty cup of coffee sitting by the sink. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. If she was out of town, why was there fresh coffee? Then I heard it, a faint noise from upstairs. It wasn't the sound of a cat. It was the distinct creak of footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening as the slow, deliberate steps continued above me, crossing the floorboards directly overhead. Someone was in the house. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, as if any sudden movement would draw attention to my presence. I turned off the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The steps stopped abruptly. The silence was louder than the noise. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting, praying that whoever it was hadn't heard me. Then came the soft click of a door opening upstairs. My mind raced. Was it a burglar? Someone squatting? Whoever it was, they didn't belong here, and neither did I. I cursed myself for not checking more carefully. The footsteps resumed, this time heading toward the staircase. Slowly, methodically, the boards creaked with every step as they descended, inching closer to the ground floor. I needed to leave now. I spun around, heading for the front door as quietly as I could. But just as my hand reached the doorknob, the steps stopped. Right behind me, a breath hitched in my throat as I felt a presence, just inches away. I could hear the faintest exhale, someone standing close enough that I could feel the shift in the air. Without thinking, I yanked the door open and bolted outside, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I sprinted to my car, hands shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. Only then did I dare glance back. And that's when I saw it. The front door was still open, swinging slowly in the wind. But no one stood there. No shadow, no figure watching me leave. Just the empty doorway, as if the house itself had swallowed whoever had been inside. When I finally got home, I called my friend. My voice trembled as I told her what happened, desperate for some kind of explanation. But when she answered, all she said was, "I don't know what house you went into, but that wasn't mine." I hung up, staring at my phone, the pieces slowly clicking into place. I had no idea whose house I had just walked into, or who had been upstairs, waiting for me to leave. It was almost midnight, and I was finally settling in after a long day. I had just turned off the lights and crawled into bed when I heard the knock. At first, I thought I imagined it, just the house settling or the wind stirring something outside. But there was again 3 sharp knocks at the front door. My heart gave a little jump. No one ever came by this late. I sat up in bed, listening closely. The sound was deliberate, not urgent, just loud enough to be unsettling. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no texts. Who knocks at a door these days without calling first? For a moment, I just sat there, hoping they'd go away. But the knocking came again, harder this time. I slipped out of bed, heart thudding in my chest, and tiptoed to the window, peeking through the curtain. Nothing. The porch was empty. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. The knock had been too clear, too close to mistake. The porch light was on, casting a weak yellow glow, and the driveway was empty. I stared at the door, my brain scrambling for logical answers. Maybe a neighbor in trouble? A lost traveler? The next knock made me jump. 3 firm raps, more insistent this time, like they knew I was listening. I crept toward the door, every instinct telling me not to open it. But curiosity gnawed at me. I needed to know who was out there. I flicked on the hallway light and stood at the door just inches away from whoever, or whatever was on the other side. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just silence pressing against the door. I leaned closer, holding my breath, and squinted through the peephole. At first I saw nothing, just the porch light's dim glow casting long shadows. But then movement. A figure stood just to the side, out of the peephole's view. My throat went dry as I realized they had deliberately positioned themselves where I couldn't see them. They were standing there, waiting. My hands felt clammy as I backed away from the door. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping the threat would scare them off. Still nothing. No footsteps retreating, no response, just that awful, suffocating silence. I stared at the door, waiting for the next knock. Instead, I heard the handle rattle, just slightly like someone testing to see if it was locked. That's when the panic hit me. I hadn't locked the deadbolt earlier. My fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting it just as the handle gave another slow, deliberate turn. Whoever was out there knew I was alone. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push. I stepped back, breath catching in my throat, and grabbed my phone from the table. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed 911, holding the phone to my ear, but before the operator answered, the doorknob stopped moving. Everything went still. I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. I strained to hear any sound. Footsteps on the porch, retreating down the driveway. But there was only silence. Then, just as I let out a shaky breath, the back door creaked. A rush of cold fear flooded my chest. I'd forgotten about the back door. It led from the kitchen to the small yard, and I hadn't locked it earlier either. They must have circled around. I bolted down the hallway, phone still clutched in my hand. The kitchen was dark, the back door slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I slammed it shut, twisting the lock as hard as I could. I pressed my ear to the door, heart pounding in my throat, listening for any sound outside. Nothing. The night stretched out beyond the thin wooden frame, silent, patient, watching. Then the softest knock. Just a single, gentle tap, right on the other side of the door. I stumbled backward, phone slipping from my hand. Whoever it was, they were right there on the other side. They knew I was listening. I scrambled to grab the phone again, dialing with shaking fingers. The operator's voice finally came through. 911. What's your emergency? Someone's at my door. I whispered, my voice cracking. They tried the front, and now they're at the back. Stay on the line, the operator said. Officers are on their way. I sank to the floor, back pressed against the door, heart hammering in my chest. Minutes dragged by, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, I heard it. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. I pressed my ear to the door one last time. Silence. By the time the police arrived, whoever had been there was long gone. The officers searched the yard and the surrounding streets, but found nothing. No footprints. No sign anyone had been there at all. I tried to tell myself it was just some prank, but deep down, I knew better. Whoever had knocked knew exactly what they were doing. They were testing me. And the worst part? I don't think they wanted to get in that night. They wanted me to know they could. I was on the last train home, exhausted from a long day at work. The train was nearly empty, just a few passengers scattered across the car, and the night outside was cold and dark. We rolled into a small station I didn't recognize. The train hissed to a stop, doors sliding open to let the chilly air rush in. No one got on, and after a minute, the doors closed with a dull thud. I glanced at my watch. 15 more minutes, and I'd be home. That's when I noticed him. A man seated at the far end of the car. I hadn't seen him get on, and I hadn't noticed him earlier, but there he was, slumped forward with his head tilted at an odd angle. Something about the way he sat made my skin prickle. His coat was too thin for the weather, and he had a backpack that looked almost too heavy for him. He hadn't moved once since I noticed him, just sat there, staring at his hands. I shifted in my seat, trying not to overthink it. Late-night trains attract all kinds of people. Still, I couldn't help but keep glancing his way, each time hoping he wouldn't notice me watching. The train rattled on, the clack of the wheels on the tracks the only sound in the cabin. The other passengers seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of us. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. I sighed, shoving it back in my coat pocket. The next time I looked up, the man was sitting 2 rows closer. I froze. I hadn't heard him move. He hadn't made a sound. He was still sitting the same way, head tilted, hands folded, staring down. But now he was closer. Too close. My stomach tightened. Had I missed something? Had I looked away longer than I thought? I glanced out the window, but the world beyond was nothing but darkness rushing by. I tried to focus on something else, looking down at the pattern on the floor. When I glanced up again, he had moved even closer, just 1 row ahead of me now. I felt a jolt of panic surge through me. There was no way he could have moved that quietly. My mouth went dry, and my fingers dug into the strap of my bag. I thought about switching cars at the next stop. Or maybe it was better to just stay put. Maybe he was harmless, just a strange man riding the same train. The train jerked, slowing down for another station. I stood up, gripping the pole for balance. My eyes darted toward the door, my breath quickening. Just a few more seconds and the doors would open. I could switch cars, get some distance between us. The train stopped, but the doors didn't open. A mechanical groan echoed through the car, followed by silence. I stared at the doors, willing them to open, but they didn't move. Then I felt it, the man's gaze. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest, and met his eyes for the first time. They were wide and empty, his expression flat, like he wasn't seeing me, but something beyond me. And that's when I noticed something worse, his hands. They were gripping the edge of his seat so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His nails long, jagged, pressed into the fabric, leaving small tears. He wasn't just sitting there. He was holding himself back, as if waiting for the right moment to spring. The train shuddered, then lurched forward again, picking up speed. I stayed standing, clutching the pole, trying to act calm. But inside, my heart raced and every instinct told me to run, to get off at the next stop no matter what. I shifted my weight, preparing to move. The man smiled, just slightly, just enough to let me know that he knew exactly what I was thinking. The lights flickered. For a brief moment, Everything plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back, he was right in front of me. I stumbled backward, heart in my throat, every muscle screaming to get away. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as if he was waiting for something, daring me to react. I bolted down the aisle, slamming into the door at the end of the car. It didn't budge. I banged on it, adrenaline coursing through my veins, panic clouding my thoughts. Behind me, I could hear the man's slow, deliberate footsteps. He was in no hurry, just closing the distance one step at a time. The train entered a tunnel, plunging us back into darkness. In the pitch black, his footsteps were the only thing I could hear, each one louder, closer. Then the train screeched to a stop, lights flickering back to life. I didn't think. I just yanked the emergency lever. The doors hissed open, and I threw myself onto the platform, gasping for air. The cold night air stung my face, but I didn't care. I looked back, expecting to see him, but the train doors slid shut before I could catch a glimpse. I stood there, panting, watching as the train disappeared into the night. The platform was empty, just me, standing alone in the freezing cold. When I finally got home, I told myself it was nothing, a weird encounter, nothing more. But I stopped taking the late train after that, because the way he looked at me, like he knew exactly what I was thinking, still haunts me. And the worst part? I'll never know what would have happened if those doors hadn't opened in time. It was just after 11 p.m., and I was sitting in my car at the back of a nearly empty grocery store parking lot. I've been waiting for a friend to finish their shift, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The lot was quiet, lit by dim overhead lights. A few scattered cars sat abandoned by late shoppers, but otherwise, it was just me. At least, that's what I thought. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Someone stepping into the glow of one of the overhead lights. He was standing a few rows over, facing my car, just standing there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe another worker finishing a shift or someone waiting for a ride. But he didn't move. He just stood there, head slightly tilted, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. But my fingers tightened around my phone, and I adjusted the rearview mirror, trying to keep an eye on him without making it obvious. The man took a step closer. Something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in any hurry, made my stomach twist. I told myself to stay calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just standing there. But my heart started to race anyway. I locked the doors, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the car. I glanced at the time on my phone, 11:13 p.m. My friend wouldn't be out for another 15 minutes. When I looked up again, the man was closer, 2 rows away now, and still facing me. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and the dim light overhead cast long shadows on his face, making it impossible to read his expression. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I debated calling my friend, but it felt silly. What would I say? Hey, there's some weird guy standing in the lot. Can you come out early? The man took another step forward. This time, I could see his eyes. They glinted in the low light, fixed on me with a strange intensity, like he wasn't just looking, but studying me. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how alone I was in the car. I tapped the screen of my phone, unlocking it with shaky fingers. I opened a text to my friend. You almost done? Before I could hit send, the man started walking. Not fast, not slow, just steady, purposeful strides that carried him across the lot and straight toward my car. My pulse thundered in my ears as panic kicked in. I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and reached for the keys, jamming them into the ignition with trembling hands. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. The man kept coming. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement, and slammed on the gas. The car jerked backward, the headlights sweeping across the lot. And for a second, I lost sight of him. Then he reappeared, just a few feet from my bumper. His face was clearer now, and there was something terrifying in the calmness of it, like he'd known all along what I was going to do. I threw the gear into drive and stomped on the gas. The car shot forward, heart hammering in my chest as I tore out of the lot. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My phone buzzed from the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen, a text from my friend, "Be out in 5." I clenched the wheel, knuckles white, every nerve in my body screaming at me to keep driving. But something made me slow down as I reached the lot's exit. I stole a quick glance in the rearview mirror. The man stood exactly where I had left him, in the middle of the lot, staring after me. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. It was slow, deliberate, like he knew I'd be back someday. Like this was just the beginning. I never went back to that parking lot. My friend found another ride, and I made excuses every time they asked me to pick them up, because I knew whatever that man had planned, it wasn't random, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I got home late that night, exhausted from work and ready to collapse. The apartment was dark and silent, just the way I liked it. I tossed my bag on the couch, kicked off my shoes, and headed straight for the bathroom to wash up before bed. When I reached the bathroom door, though, it was closed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I had shut it without realizing. I reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked. That's when I stopped, confusion prickling at the back of my mind. I lived alone. There was no reason for that door to be locked. I jiggled the handle again, harder this time, and knocked lightly on the wood. "Hello," I said, half expecting to hear nothing in return. The silence on the other side of the door stretched long enough to make my skin crawl. A strange, thick quiet, like someone was standing just beyond the door listening. I stood frozen, staring at the door handle, my heart beating faster now. Had I locked it from the inside somehow? No, that wasn't possible. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door. The wood was cold against my skin. At first, I heard nothing, just the hum of the apartment settling around me. But then a faint shuffle. Someone was inside. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath hitched as 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. Was someone in my apartment this whole time? How did they get in? I grabbed my phone from my pocket, hands shaking as I unlocked it. My thumb hovered over the call button, ready to dial 911. But then I stopped. What if I was overreacting? Maybe it was a maintenance worker, or someone had come in by accident. I needed to think. Who was in there? I called out, louder this time. For a moment, there was nothing. Just that terrible, heavy silence. Then, the softest sound. A slow, deliberate scrape, like fingers trailing along the door from the other side. Goosebumps ran down my arms. Whoever was in there wasn't answering. They were just standing there, listening. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. Every instinct told me to get out, to leave the apartment. But part of me didn't want to leave. If someone had gotten in, I wanted to know how and why. I clenched the phone tighter and made my way to the kitchen. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron pan, and moved back toward the bathroom, heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I reached the door again, pan raised, ready to swing. My hand hovered over the handle. I took a deep breath, and then the lock clicked. The sound was so sudden, so deliberate, that I nearly dropped the pan. Someone had unlocked the door from the inside. My heart stopped. I stood frozen, staring at the handle, watching as it slowly turned on its own. The door creaked open an inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. For a moment, I couldn't move. Cold air spilled from the gap, brushing my skin. And then a shadow shifted inside. I didn't wait to see more. I dropped the pan with a loud clatter and bolted. My feet pounded against the floor as I ran for the front door. I didn't stop to grab my keys, didn't even look behind me. I flung the door open and sprinted down the hall, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the stairwell and descended 3 flights without slowing down. When I finally reached the bottom, I glanced back up the stairwell, and there at the top the bathroom door slowly swung shut. I called the police from the lobby, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. They arrived in minutes, checked the apartment from top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No one inside. The officers told me it was probably a faulty lock, that maybe I'd left the bathroom door ajar and it had swung closed. But I knew better. I knew someone had been in there. And the worst part? They didn't run. They wanted me to know they could leave whenever they wanted. quiet night. I had the apartment to myself for the weekend and planned to unwind with a movie and some takeout. The city outside my window buzzed softly, cars humming along distant streets, and a cool breeze filtered through the open windows. Everything was fine until I noticed the draft. It hit me all at once, cold, much colder than it should have been. I glanced toward the window near my couch. The same window I always kept open, just a crack for fresh air. But now it was wide open. My stomach sank. I hadn't opened it that far. I was sure of it. I stared at the window for a moment, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I had opened it wider earlier without thinking. But the unsettling chill that crawled over my skin told me otherwise. I stood up slowly, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavier, as if the walls were closing in. My ears strained to catch any sound, any indication that someone had come in through the window. But there was nothing, just the soft hum of the city outside. I stepped toward the window, forcing myself to move even though every instinct told me to stay put. I peered outside into the alley below, dark and empty, just dumpsters and a flickering streetlight. A nervous laugh escaped my lips. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it pushed the window open, and I was freaking out over nothing. I reached for the window, ready to slide it shut, and then I froze. Something on the windowsill caught my eye, a faint smudge, almost invisible in the dim light. A fingerprint. A sharp jolt of fear shot through me. Someone had been here. Someone had touched the window. I jerked the window shut with trembling hands and locked it tight. My pulse was pounding now, each beat echoing in my ears. I stood there, gripping the lock, heart racing as I tried to think. Had they gotten inside? I turned around slowly, scanning the apartment. Everything looked normal. The furniture in place, no sign of forced entry, nothing missing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt different. I crept toward the kitchen, holding my breath. The cabinets were closed, the sink empty. I peeked into the bathroom. Nothing. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but my body refused to relax. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet door in the hallway was slightly ajar. I stared at it, heart thudding painfully against my ribs. I hadn't touched that door all day. I knew that for sure. It had been shut tight the last time I walked by. The crack in the door was so narrow, just wide enough to be intentional. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone hiding inside? Slowly, I edged closer, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. I reached out with a shaky hand, fingers grazing the edge of the closet door. Every muscle in my body tensed as I gave it a gentle push, opening it wider, inch by inch. At first, I saw nothing but coats and an old pair of shoes. The fear gripping my chest started to loosen. Maybe I was just overthinking. Maybe the door hadn't been shut after all. But then a movement. A figure shifted behind the coats. My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just stared, frozen in place. And then the figure moved again, stepping slowly out from the shadows. A man. He stood there, no mask, no attempt to hide. Just a slow, calm smile spreading across his face. Like he'd been waiting for me to find him. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming for me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You forgot to lock the window," he whispered, his voice low and soft, like we were sharing a secret. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't grab my phone, just sprinted toward the front door, yanking it open with shaking hands. I ran down the hallway, my heart thundering in my chest, not stopping until I reached the street below. When I looked back up at the apartment window, the lights were still on. But the window, the one I had shut and locked, was open again. I never went back that night. I called the police from the street, watching the window from a distance, waiting for them to arrive. They found no one inside, no sign of forced entry, nothing out of place except for the open window. The officer told me it was probably just a prank, a burglar who got scared off. But I knew better. He didn't come to steal anything. I wasn't expecting anyone, so the sound startled me a little. I assumed it was just a package, something I'd forgotten I ordered. Happens all the time. I opened the door to find a box on the doorstep. It was plain, no branding or markings, just a standard brown cardboard box with clear tape sealing it shut. There was no delivery truck in sight, just the empty streets stretching out in both directions. I leaned down to inspect the label. That's when I noticed the address. It wasn't mine. It was close, just a block over, but not the right address. I figured it was an easy mistake. Maybe a lazy delivery driver mixed it up. I thought about leaving it on my porch for the carrier to correct, but curiosity got the better of me. The box was heavier than it looked. Not the kind of weight you'd expect from clothes or something soft. It felt dense, like there was something solid inside. I carried it inside, placing it on the kitchen table. The tape along the top looked slightly peeled, as if someone had already tried to open it. A strange feeling settled in my gut, but I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a package. I grabbed a pair of scissors, slit the tape, and pulled back the flaps. Inside was a neatly folded jacket, dark green, with patches along the sleeves and stains on the cuffs. It looked worn, used. Beneath it, there were other small items, an old flashlight, a coil of rope, and a knife. My hands froze over the open box. The blade was clean, but something about it made my skin crawl. The handle was wrapped in old black tape, and there were tiny scratches on the blade, as if it had been used repeatedly for something. Why would anyone ship this? I carefully pulled out the flashlight, feeling its cold, metal weight in my palm. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, a musty metallic scent like old coins or rusty pipes. I checked the box again, peeling back the flaps further, and that's when I saw the note. It was just a single piece of paper, folded neatly and tucked beneath the knife. I opened it slowly, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Written in small, neat handwriting were the words, "Return to sender." My heart skipped a beat. Return it? To who? And why? A creeping sense of unease spread through me as I stared at the words on the page. The box didn't have a sender's name, just the wrong address. Suddenly, I felt like I shouldn't have opened it, like I had disturbed something I shouldn't have touched. And then I heard it, a knock at the front door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow and deliberate, 3 taps spaced perfectly apart. My blood ran cold. No one should have been at the door. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen anyone approach. It was as if they'd appeared out of nowhere. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the open box, my heart racing in my chest. What if it was the person the package belonged to? What if they'd realized the delivery had gone to the wrong house and came to collect it? The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. I grabbed the knife from the box, my fingers trembling as I held it in front of me. Every instinct told me not to open the door, but I had to know. I tiptoed toward the front door, knife clutched tightly, and peered through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty porch and the street beyond. But then, a shadow shifted at the edge of the peephole's view. Someone was standing just to the side of the door, out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away from the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking for help. They were waiting. I could feel it. I stared at the package on the table, the note with its cryptic message, "Return to sender." And then something even worse occurred to me. What if the package wasn't meant for the wrong address after all? The parking garage was nearly empty, its echoing silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. My footsteps seemed too loud as they bounced off the cold concrete walls. The garage always felt eerie at night, but tonight something felt different, off somehow. I told myself it was just exhaustion. I'd parked on the 3rd floor, near the stairwell. The elevator was slow and creaky, so I always took the stairs, especially this late at night. I reached the 2nd floor landing and was about to start up the next flight when I heard it. A faint shuffle coming from above. I froze. The sound was small, just the scuff of a shoe, maybe, but it was enough to send a jolt of unease through me. No one else should be here this late. I strained my ears, waiting to hear it again, but the silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. My heart began to race. I thought about heading back down to the 1st floor, but my car was just 1 flight up. I forced myself to keep climbing, one hand gripping the metal railing, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up my spine. As I reached the third floor, I saw him. A man stood by the stairwell door, just a few feet from where I needed to exit. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of a baseball cap. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still like he was waiting for something. I stopped mid-step, heart hammering in my chest. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a second, our gazes locked. There was no expression on his face, no greeting, no acknowledgement, just a cold, neutral stare that sent a chill straight through me. I forced a tight smile, hoping to come off as casual, as if nothing was wrong. He didn't smile back. My mind raced. What was he doing here so late? Maybe he was just lost, or waiting for someone. But why stand by the stairwell, so perfectly still? Something about him felt deliberate. I tried to ignore the panic building in my chest, and took a step toward the door. That's when he moved. He shifted slightly, just enough to block the door, his shoulders squaring as if to say, "You're not going anywhere." A wave of fear hit me, so hard it felt like ice running through my veins. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to run back down the stairs. But something told me not to. If I ran, he would follow. I swallowed hard, pretending not to notice him as I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course. I shoved it back into my pocket, my hands trembling. He took a step closer. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a step back, matching his movement without thinking. He didn't stop. Another step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between us inch by inch. I forced myself to speak, though my voice wavered. Do you need something?" He didn't answer. His eyes never left mine, dark and empty, as if he was trying to decide something. And then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they know they have the upper hand. My stomach twisted into knots. I backed away slowly, toward the other end of the stairwell, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't follow, just stood there, still smiling, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he enjoyed watching me squirm. I made it to the end of the landing, where the second-floor stairwell door was just within reach. I grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and bolted down the stairs without looking back. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were going to burst, but I didn't stop. I sprinted down to the first floor, slamming through the door into the main garage. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic, and threw myself into the car. The engine roared to life, and I backed out so fast the tires screeched against the concrete. As I peeled out of the garage, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing at the top of the ramp, watching me leave. And the worst part? He was still smiling. I picked up the babysitting gig through a friend of a friend, last minute, good pay, and just a few hours on a quiet Saturday night. It sounded perfect. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, tucked between identical two-story homes, all with neat little yards. The parents were nice, but in a hurry, running late for some kind of anniversary dinner. They gave me the usual rundown: emergency numbers on the fridge, snacks in the kitchen, and the baby monitor on the coffee table. "Jack's already asleep," the mom said, grabbing her coat. "He's usually out for the night. You shouldn't have any trouble." The dad flashed a grateful smile as they hurried out the door. I locked it behind them, listening to their car pull away, and then the house was mine, just me and sleeping baby Jack upstairs. I settled on the couch, flipping through the channels aimlessly, one ear tuned to the baby monitor. The house was so quiet it felt like I was the only person in the world. After an hour, the monitor crackled, just static at first, soft but noticeable. I sat up, glancing toward it. The little screen on the side was lit, but it was just a blur of gray and black fuzz. I adjusted the volume. Then I heard it, a faint sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a word, like a soft, drawn-out exhale. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. Maybe Jack had stirred in his sleep, a half-wakeful murmur. I leaned closer, listening. Another sound, clearer this time, a creak like the sound of weight shifting on the floor. My stomach twisted. I told myself it was just the crib rocking or an old house settling in the night. But the sound, it was deliberate. Someone was moving in Jack's room. I grabbed the baby monitor, staring at the screen. Still nothing, just static. The crackle of the device buzzed louder in my ears as my pulse began to race. The parents said Jack would sleep through the night. He shouldn't have been awake. And if he was, why wasn't he making any noise? I stood, my legs unsteady, and crept toward the staircase. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I tried to convince myself there was nothing to worry about, but each step I took felt like dragging a weight behind me. The stairs creaked under my feet, the soft groan of wood amplifying the silence around me. Halfway up, the baby monitor in my hand hissed, then went dead. I stopped cold. My heart felt like it was lodged in my throat. Something was wrong, very wrong. I forced myself to keep going, gripping the banister so hard my knuckles turned white. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the night light plugged into the wall. Jack's door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hall. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door creaked as I nudged it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a small lamp. Jack was still in his crib, lying perfectly still, his tiny chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sleep. But someone else had been in the room. The rocking chair in the corner swayed gently, as if someone had just stood up. My entire body tensed. I scanned the room, heart hammering in my chest. The window was closed, the closet door slightly ajar, but no sign of anyone else. I backed toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. My fingers fumbled over the screen, trying to call the parents. But then, I heard it, a soft click, the sound of a door closing somewhere downstairs. They weren't gone. Whoever had been in the room was still in the house. Panic surged through me. I scooped Jack out of the crib, clutching him tightly to my chest, and bolted out of the room. His small body stirred but didn't wake as I raced down the hall. I could feel it, the presence still lingering in the house, watching, waiting. I reached the front door, heart racing. My shaking hands struggled with the lock for what felt like an eternity. Then finally, the door swung open. I ran outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and didn't stop until I reached the street. I turned back, panting, eyes locked on the darkened house. The front door was still open, swinging slowly on its hinges. But there was no sound, no movement, just the heavy silence of an empty house. When the parents returned, I handed over Jack and told them everything. They didn't seem to believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I'd heard, and the worst part, there was nothing missing. Whoever had been in that house didn't come to steal. I was waiting for my boyfriend, Matt, to get home from work. He told me earlier he'd call once his shift ended, but it was already past midnight, and I hadn't heard a word. It wasn't like him to be late without letting me know. I sent a couple of texts and tried calling, no response. His phone just kept ringing. The apartment felt too quiet. I muted the TV and stared at my phone, waiting for a message to come through. Nothing. My stomach twisted with anxiety. Maybe he'd stayed late, or maybe his phone had died. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me something else, something worse. After an hour, I decided to call him one more time. This time, the ringing stopped after 2 rings, and someone picked up, but no one spoke. All I could hear was a faint shuffle, like the phone had been dropped in someone's pocket. "Matt," I whispered, heart racing. No response. Just that muffled shuffle and a strange, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, deliberate and steady. "Hello." My voice was shaky now. "Matt, are you there?" Suddenly, the phone clicked and the line went dead. A wave of dread washed over me. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling. Had someone else answered his phone? I tried calling again, but now it went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I grabbed my jacket and decided to head over to his apartment. If he wasn't answering, I'd make sure everything was okay myself. His place was only a 15-minute drive away, but the night felt heavier than usual, the streets darker and emptier than they should have been. I kept glancing at my phone, hoping for a missed call or text, but it stayed silent. When I pulled up to his building, all the windows were dark, except one, his. His apartment was on the 2nd floor, and the faint glow of a light leaked through the curtains. I felt a flicker of relief. He was home, maybe asleep, and his phone was just out of reach. That had to be it. I parked and headed up the stairs, the metal steps cold and slick under my shoes. The night air was unnervingly quiet. No distant car engines, no buzzing streetlights. Just the sound of my footsteps and my own shallow breaths. When I reached his door, I noticed something strange. It wasn't fully closed. The latch hadn't caught, and the door was resting against the frame, just a fraction of an inch ajar. I told myself he'd just forgotten to lock it. Maybe he was exhausted, came home, and crashed on the couch. But a voice in the back of my head whispered, "No, this isn't right." I knocked gently. "Matt!" No answer. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The apartment was dim, lit only by the lamp on the far side of the living room. Everything looked normal, his shoes by the door, his jacket tossed over a chair. But something felt off. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something faintly metallic. I called his name again, louder this time, but the apartment stayed silent. Then I saw it, his phone on the coffee table. The screen was cracked, the casing slightly dented, as if it had been dropped. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a missed call from me on the screen, at 12:04 a.m., the exact time I tried calling. But the time now read 12:22. If he had answered earlier, where was he now? I glanced toward his bedroom door. It was closed. I stepped toward it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Something was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know if he was in there. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The cold metal felt slick against my palm. I turned it slowly, the door creaking as it swung open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, no sign of Matt. Just the open window on the far wall, the curtains swaying slightly in the night breeze. That's when I heard it, a phone buzzing. Not mine. It was still in my hand, and the screen lit up with a notification. An incoming call from my number. My throat tightened. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make any sense. How could his phone be calling him from my number? My heart pounded as I slowly raised the phone to my ear and answered. At first, there was silence on the other end. Just that same shuffling sound, the same deliberate footsteps I'd heard earlier. But this time, there was something else. A faint, shallow breath. Someone was listening. "Matt," I whispered, my voice cracking. Then a soft, familiar voice right behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was the breeze rustling the curtains and the distant hum of the city below. And the phone in my hand went dead. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.